The gas station sat on the edge of a desolate highway, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. It was late at night, and the silence was broken only by the occasional hum of a passing truck or the distant call of an owl. Nika Williams pulled into the station, her car's engine humming softly as she steered into a spot near the pumps. She glanced around, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings, taking in every detail with practiced ease. The place was nearly deserted. A lone cashier sat behind the counter inside the small convenience store, his face illuminated by the bluish glow of his phone screen. A couple of other cars were parked nearby, their occupants either asleep or preoccupied. Everything about the scene screamed mundane, yet Nika's instincts told her otherwise. She stepped out of her vehicle, dressed in a casual hoodie and jeans. Her movements were deliberate, calm, yet precise. To the untrained eye, she looked like just another traveler stopping to refuel on a long journey. But there was a subtle confidence in her stride, an awareness in her posture that hinted at something more. Nika was no ordinary woman. She was a highly trained operative for the United States Secret Service, and while this stop seemed routine, her every move was calculated, her senses heightened. She had just come off an intense operation that had taken weeks to plan and execute. Tonight was supposed to be her first moment of peace, a chance to finally let her guard down. But she knew better than anyone that danger often lurked in the most unassuming places. As she began pumping gas, she felt the weight of a gaze on her. Nika didn't turn her head, but her peripheral vision caught the outline of a pine car carpet across the lot. Inside sat Officer Paul Riley, a man whose reputation preceded him, though not for the right reasons. Riley was a cop who thrived on control, a man who often pushed his authority to the edge, sometimes beyond it. His career had been marred by complaints of misconduct, many of which were quietly buried by the department. He was known for targeting individuals who, in his mind, didn't belong, and tonight, his attention had landed squarely on Nika. From the moment she pulled into the station, Riley's eyes had been on her. Something about her presence irritated him. Maybe it was the car, sleek, clean and too expensive, looking for someone he assumed was just passing through. Maybe it was her calm demeanor, the way she carried herself with an air of quiet authority that didn't fit his narrow expectations. Or maybe it was simply her skin color. Riley wouldn't admit it to himself, but deep down, his biases always played a role in how he viewed people. To him, Nika was an anomaly, and anomalies needed to be dealt with. He sat in his patrol car, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, debating whether to act. The night had been uneventful so far, and he was itching for something to break the monotony. Nika, oblivious to none of this, finished pumping gas and walked toward the convenience store. She moved with the same deliberate ease, her mind already processing the potential outcomes of her actions. She wasn't nervous, but she wasn't relaxed either. Years of training had taught her to expect the unexpected, to always be ready for the moment when things could shift from ordinary to life-threatening. Inside the store, the cashier barely acknowledged her as she grabbed a bottle of water and a snack. She noticed the small details, how the security cameras were positioned, the flickering fluorescent light above the counter, the faint smell of cleaning supplies lingering in the air. These were the things most people would overlook, but not Nika. She had been trained to notice what others missed, and those skills had saved her life more times than she cared to count. As she paid for her items, Riley decided to make his move. He stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his belt as he walked toward the store. His boots crunched against the gravel, a sound that cut through the quiet night like a warning. Inside, Nika heard the door chime as he entered. She didn't turn to look, but saw his reflection in the glass of the refrigerated drinks section. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with an air of authority that he wore like a weapon. His gaze was locked on her, assessing, calculating. She took a slow breath, calming the slight spike of adrenaline that always came when situations like this began to unfold. Riley approached the counter, pretending to glance at the shelves as if he were just another customer, but his eyes never left her. The cashier looked up briefly, sensing the tension, but quickly returned to his phone, unwilling to get involved. Nika paid for her items and turned to leave, but Riley stepped into her path, blocking the exit. "Evening," he said, his voice gruff, carrying an edge that made it clear this was no friendly greeting. Nika met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "Evening, officer," she replied, her voice steady. She knew where this was going, and she had no intention of letting it spiral out of control. Riley folded his arms across his chest, his posture oozing authority. "What brings you out here tonight?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Nika raised an eyebrow, the corner of her mouth twitching into the faintest hint of a smile. "Just passing through," she said simply, her eyes never leaving his. Riley didn't like her calmness. It unnerved him, made him feel like he wasn't in control of the situation. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. "This isn't the kind of place people just pass through," he said, his voice hardening. "What's your business here?" Nika didn't flinch, didn't move back. "Getting gas," she said, holding up the bag with her snack and water. "And now I'm heading out." The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken challenge. Riley's hand hovered near his belt, close to his holster, though he made no move to draw his weapon. He wanted her to feel intimidated, to submit to his authority. But Nika wasn't the type to back down. She held his gaze, her calm demeanor an unspoken statement that she wasn't afraid of him. The moment stretched on, and for a brief second, Riley hesitated. Something about her didn't add up. She wasn't reacting the way most people did when confronted by a cop. There was no fear in her eyes, no defensiveness in her tone. If anything, she seemed to be assessing him, weighing her options, and that only made him angrier. Finally, Riley stepped aside, but not before throwing one last look over his shoulder as Nika walked out. She could feel his gaze burning into her back as she made her way to her car. Sliding into the driver's seat, she placed the bag on the passenger side and started the engine. Her hands were steady on the wheel, her breathing even. But she didn't leave right away. Instead, she glanced in the rearview mirror, watching as Riley returned to his patrol car, his eyes still locked on her. Nika knew this wasn't over. She had seen men like Riley before, men who thrived on control, who couldn't stand to feel outmatched. As she pulled out of the gas station and onto the highway, her mind was already calculating her next move. Riley might think he was the one in charge, but he was about to learn just how wrong he was. As Nika drove away from the gas station, her senses remained on high alert. The faint glow of the patrol car's headlights was visible in her rearview mirror, and though Riley maintained a considerable distance, she knew he was following her. His curiosity had turned into an obsession, the kind of fixation that made men like him dangerous. She wasn't surprised. Riley's demeanor back at the station had revealed his character. He was the type who thrived on control and intimidation, and the fact that she hadn't flinched under his scrutiny had likely bruised his ego. That alone was enough to make him pursue her, even without a shred of real justification. The road stretched out ahead of her, a dark ribbon cutting through the desolate countryside. Nika kept her speed steady, neither too fast nor too slow, giving Riley no legitimate reason to pull her over. Her hands gripped the steering wheel lightly, her eyes flicking between the road and the mirror. She had been in situations like this before, an unprovoked threat from someone who underestimated her, someone who didn't realize the extent of her training or the weight of her authority. For a moment, her mind raced through her options. She could stop the car, confront Riley directly, and end the situation on her terms. But that carried risks. He was already operating outside the bounds of professionalism, and she couldn't predict how far he would go to assert his authority. Alternatively, she could continue driving, see if he made the first move, and respond accordingly. The latter option was safer, but it meant giving him more time to escalate. Nika decided to wait. Riley was clearly eager for a confrontation, and she knew he would eventually make the mistake she needed to expose him. The patrol car's headlights grew closer, and within minutes they were tailing her at an uncomfortably close distance. The message was clear. Riley wanted her to know he was there. He wanted her to feel pressured to make a wrong move. But Nika's driving remained impeccable, her composure unshaken. She glanced at the dashboard clock. It was nearing midnight, and the road was empty save for the two vehicles. The isolation worked in Riley's favor. There were no witnesses, no one to question his actions, no one to challenge his authority. Then it happened. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the night, bouncing off the dark asphalt and reflecting in her mirror. The sharp wail of the siren followed, shattering the stillness. Nika exhaled slowly, her breath steady and controlled. She had anticipated this, and now that it was happening, her mind shifted into overdrive. She slowed her vehicle and pulled over to the side of the road, the crunch of gravel beneath her tires breaking the silence. The patrol car pulled up behind her, its lights still flashing. Nika kept her hands on the steering wheel, her posture calm but alert. Through the mirror, she saw Riley stepping out of his vehicle, his silhouette outlined by the strobing lights. He moved with purpose, his stride brisk, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered gun. This wasn't a routine traffic stop. His body language was too aggressive, his intent too clear. He wasn't looking for answers. He was looking for control. As he approached her window, Nika pressed the button to lower it halfway. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and distant pine. Riley leaned down slightly, his face illuminated by the glow of her dashboard. His expression was hard, his eyes narrowing as he took her in. "License and registration," he barked, skipping any pretense of politeness. His tone was clipped, authoritative, designed to elicit compliance without question. Nika met his gaze, her expression neutral. She moved slowly, deliberately, her every action calculated to avoid giving him an excuse to escalate further. She opened her glove compartment and retrieved the documents, handing them to him without a word. Riley snatched them from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers in a deliberate show of dominance. He stepped back slightly, examining the papers with a frown. "This your car?" he asked, though the question was rhetorical. The registration was right in front of him, and he could see that everything was in order. "Yes," Nika replied simply, her tone even. She didn't offer any additional information, knowing that anything she said could be twisted or used against her. Riley's frown deepened, and he looked past her, scanning the interior of her vehicle. His eyes landed on the black case resting on the passenger seat, a sleek, unmarked container that held classified equipment. Nika saw the moment his curiosity turned to suspicion, the way his jaw tightened and his eyes narrowed. "What's in the case?" he demanded, his tone taking on an accusatory edge. Nika remained calm, though her pulse quickened slightly. She knew this was the moment where things could spiral out of control. "It's personal property," she said. "Nothing illegal." Riley didn't seem satisfied with her answer. He took another step closer, his hand drifting toward his holster. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Nika didn't move. "Is there a reason for this, officer?" she asked, her tone still calm, but with a subtle undercurrent of authority. She wasn't challenging him outright, but she wasn't submitting either. Riley's lips pressed into a thin line, his frustration evident. "I said step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Nika could see the anger simmering beneath the surface, the way his grip on his holster tightened as if daring her to resist. She weighed her options, knowing that compliance would likely embolden him, but resistance could escalate the situation further. Finally, she nodded and unbuckled her seatbelt. Moving with deliberate slowness, she opened the door and stepped out, keeping her hands visible at all times. Riley gestured for her to move toward the back of her car, and she complied, her every step measured and controlled. He followed closely behind, his presence looming, his breath audible in the quiet night. "Place your hands on the trunk," he instructed, and she did so without hesitation. As Riley began patting her down, Nika felt a surge of anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. This wasn't about procedure, this was about humiliation, about proving his dominance over someone he perceived as a threat simply for existing. But she remained silent, letting him dig his own grave with every unnecessary action. When he finished the search and found nothing, Riley turned his attention back to the black case in her car. "Open it," he demanded, pointing toward the passenger seat. Nika straightened, her expression unreadable. "I can't do that," she said simply. Riley's frustration boiled over. "Open the case," he repeated, his voice almost a growl. "It's classified," Nika replied, her tone firm. "You don't have the clearance to see what's inside." The statement hung in the air, a direct challenge to his authority. Riley stared at her, his face contorting with a mixture of confusion and rage. He wasn't used to being told no, especially not by someone he thought he could intimidate. "You think you're above the law?" he spat, taking a step closer. Nika held her ground, her eyes locked on his. "I'm following the law," she said. "You're the one crossing the line." For a moment, the two of them stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then, without warning, Riley reached for the case, his fingers curling around the handle as he yanked it from the seat. But as soon as he did, a faint beeping sound filled the air, a warning signal that caused Nika's lips to curve into the faintest hint of a smile. "Wrong move," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made Riley falter. Before he could react, the distant sound of engines broke through the night, growing louder with each passing second. Riley looked up, his confusion turning to unease as the headlights of several black SUVs came into view, speeding toward them with precision and purpose. Nika didn't move, her calm demeanor unchanged. She knew her team was here, and Riley was about to learn just how far out of his depth he was. Riley's grip on the black case tightened as the sound of the approaching SUVs grew louder. He was frozen for a moment, caught between his swelling anger at being challenged by Nika and the creeping realization that something larger was happening, something he couldn't control. His instinct for dominance pushed him forward, yet the noise of the engines and the determined look on Nika's face planted a seed of doubt in his mind. He quickly shook it off, unwilling to concede even an inch of authority. "Stay where you are," Riley barked at Nika, pointing a finger at her as if trying to reassert control over the situation. His voice carried the sharpness of a man teetering on the edge of frustration and desperation. Nika didn't move. Her gaze remained locked on him, her expression as calm as it had been since their first encounter. This only seemed to infuriate him further. The SUVs pulled up abruptly, their headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating the tense standoff. 4 vehicles in total formed a semicircle around the patrol car and Nika's vehicle, their engines rumbling ominously. The doors opened almost in unison, and out stepped several individuals dressed in plain black tactical gear. Their movements were purposeful, synchronized, and professional. These were not ordinary law enforcement officers. Their presence exuded authority and skill on an entirely different level. Riley's eyes darted between the newcomers, his confusion evident. He rested his hand on his holster, his instincts telling him to prepare for trouble, though he had no idea what kind of trouble this was. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice rising to mask his uncertainty. "Who are you people, and what are you doing here?" One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed carved from stone, stepped forward. His dark sunglasses hid his eyes, but his entire demeanor radiated control. He carried no visible weapons, only a small earpiece that suggested he was in communication with someone. "Officer Paul Riley," the man asked, his voice low and steady, each word deliberate. Riley's stance stiffened, his grip on his holster tightening. "Yeah, that's me," he replied, trying to sound authoritative, but failing to hide the edge of uncertainty in his tone. "Who are you? And why are you interrupting an active investigation?" The man ignored Riley's question, his head tilting slightly as if he were listening to something through his earpiece. After a moment, he nodded and took another step forward. "Step away from the case," he instructed, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "What?" Riley shot back, his voice now a mix of confusion and defiance. "This is evidence. I'm in the middle of an investigation. You don't have jurisdiction here, whoever you are." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and produced a small badge, holding it up just long enough for Riley to see the emblem of the United States Secret Service. Riley's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before his expression hardened. "Secret Service?" he scoffed, trying to mask his growing unease with bravado. "What the hell does the Secret Service have to do with this?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned his attention to Nika, who hadn't moved from her spot near the back of her car. "Agent Williams," he said, his voice softening slightly but still carrying an air of command. "Are you all right?" Nika nodded once, her calm demeanor unchanged. "I'm fine," she replied, though Officer Riley here seems determined to complicate things. Riley's jaw clenched at her words, his frustration bubbling over. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Who is she, and what's in that case?" The man in black finally turned his full attention back to Riley, his expression unreadable. "Agent Williams is a member of the United States Secret Service, currently operating under direct orders from a classified federal directive. The case you're holding contains sensitive materials related to national security. Your interference has already been noted, Officer Riley, and you are now being ordered to stand down." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Riley's mind raced, his thoughts a chaotic mix of disbelief, anger, and fear. He wanted to push back, to assert his authority, but the weight of the man's words and the calm, unwavering presence of the agents around him made him hesitate. He glanced at Nika, who simply watched him with an unreadable expression, then back at the man in black. "This is my jurisdiction," Riley said finally, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "I have the right to investigate suspicious activity." The man's expression didn't change. "You are dangerously close to obstructing a federal operation," he said evenly. "This is your final warning. Step away from the case and return to your vehicle." Riley's grip on the case tightened as his frustration reached its peak. He couldn't stand the thought of being undermined, of having his authority stripped away by people he didn't even recognize. In a last-ditch effort to reclaim control, he took a step forward, holding the case up as if it were a trophy. "You think you can just walk in here and tell me what to do?" he spat, his voice shaking slightly. "This is my town, my rules. You don't scare me." The man in black didn't flinch. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made Riley falter. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said. "This is not a game, Officer Riley. Put the case down." Before Riley could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "He's not going to listen." It was Nika. She stepped away from her car, her movements as calm and deliberate as ever. She approached Riley slowly, her eyes locked on his, her presence commanding despite her smaller stature. "People like him never do," she continued, her tone sharp. "They think their badge gives them the right to do whatever they want, to control whoever they want. But that's not how this ends." Riley's face flushed with anger, but before he could retaliate, the man in black held up a hand. "Enough," he said firmly. He turned to one of the other agents and gave a small nod. The agent stepped forward and produced a tablet, tapping a few buttons before holding it up for Riley to see. Riley's eyes widened as the screen lit up, displaying a live feed of his actions from the past 20 minutes. Every word he had said, every move he had made, had been recorded by hidden cameras placed in the area. The feed even showed the moment he had grabbed the case from Nika's car. "This is being transmitted to federal authorities as we speak," the man in black said. "Your actions tonight will be reviewed, and I strongly suggest you think carefully about your next move." Riley's grip on the case loosened as the weight of the situation finally hit him. He glanced around at the agents surrounding him, at Nika's calm, unyielding expression, and at the live feed on the tablet. For the first time that night, he realized just how far out of his depth he was. Slowly, reluctantly, Riley lowered the case and placed it on the ground. He stepped back, his shoulders slumping as the adrenaline drained from his system. The man in black signaled to one of the agents, who stepped forward and picked up the case, securing it in one of the SUVs. Nika stepped closer to Riley, her gaze steady and piercing. "Next time you see someone who doesn't fit your narrow definition of belonging," she said quietly, "remember this moment. Remember how easily your assumptions can bring you down." Riley didn't respond. He simply stood there, his face a mask of defeat, as the agents returned to their vehicles and prepared to leave. Nika gave him one last look before turning and climbing into one of the SUVs. The engines roared to life, and within moments, the vehicles disappeared into the night, leaving Riley alone on the dark, empty road, a man who had finally been forced to confront the limits of his power. As the sound of the SUVs faded into the distance, the night seemed to stretch into a heavy, suffocating silence. Officer Paul Riley stood in the middle of the road, his patrol car's lights still flashing, painting his surroundings in disorienting pulses of red and blue. His mind raced, grasping for explanations, excuses, and anything to salvage what remained of his shattered authority. The brief but searing humiliation burned into his chest like a brand, leaving him seething with anger and confusion. For a moment, Riley considered radioing his station, but he hesitated. What could he possibly say? That he had been overpowered by a group of agents from the Secret Service. That he had lost control of a situation he never understood to begin with. No, he couldn't admit that, not to his colleagues, not to his superiors. Instead, he clenched his fists and glared at the empty road ahead, his mind replaying every moment of the confrontation. He convinced himself that there had to be something he had missed, some clue that would justify his actions and turn this situation in his favor. He wasn't about to let this night end like this. Meanwhile, not far away, Nika Williams sat quietly in the back of one of the SUVs. The agents around her spoke in low, measured tones, reviewing the situation on their tablets and communicating updates to their command center. Nika didn't join the conversation. Her focus remained on the faint glow of the highway lights in the distance. She was calm on the surface, but her thoughts were sharp and precise, dissecting the events of the night. This wasn't the first time she had encountered someone like Riley, a man blinded by prejudice, drunk on authority, and too stubborn to admit when he was outmatched. Men like him weren't rare, and Nika had dealt with them throughout her career. But there was something particularly infuriating about how he had handled the situation. He hadn't just crossed a line, he had done so with reckless abandon, endangering not only her operation but his own career. Yet, as much as she wanted to feel satisfaction at the way he had been put in his place, there was a lingering unease in her chest. Men like Riley rarely learned from moments like these. They stewed, plotted, and found ways to dig themselves even deeper into trouble. As if on cue, her thoughts were interrupted by the low hum of her earpiece. One of the agents in the front seat glanced back at her. "Agent Williams," he said, his voice calm but serious. "Command wants an update. They're asking if you believe Officer Riley is still a threat." Nika's eyes narrowed slightly as she considered the question. She didn't answer right away, instead leaning back in her seat and folding her arms across her chest. "He's reckless," she said finally. "And he doesn't like being embarrassed. Men like that don't just let things go." The agent nodded, taking note of her response before returning to his work. Nika glanced out the window, her instincts prickling with unease. She had no doubt Riley was fuming, and she suspected he wasn't done trying to assert himself. The question was, how far was he willing to go? Riley, meanwhile, had made his decision. He climbed back into his patrol car, slamming the door shut with enough force to make the vehicle shudder. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he stared down the empty road ahead. The black SUVs were gone, but that didn't mean they had disappeared completely. Riley convinced himself that he could still regain control of the situation. Maybe they had missed something. Maybe the case wasn't as secure as they claimed, or maybe this wasn't over yet. Without hesitating further, Riley turned off the flashing lights of his car and began driving, his eyes scanning the road for any sign of the SUVs. He kept his speed steady, blending into the shadows of the highway, determined to follow any lead that might justify his actions. His thoughts churned with justifications, excuses, and defiance. He was certain that if he could just prove anything, it would vindicate him. The humiliation he had suffered would be worth it, and he could finally show them that they had underestimated him. As he drove, his radio crackled to life. "Unit 12 status update." The dispatcher's voice came through, calm and professional. Riley hesitated, his jaw tightening. He didn't want to report what had happened, not yet. Instead, he grabbed the radio and replied curtly, "Unit 12 is conducting follow-up on a suspicious vehicle. I'll check in shortly." The dispatcher acknowledged his response, and the line went silent again. The road stretched on, and the faint glow of tail lights appeared in the distance. Riley's pulse quickened. He turned off his headlights, using the dim light of the moon to guide him as he closed the gap between his car and the vehicle ahead. As he drew closer, his heart sank. It wasn't one of the SUVs, it was a civilian car, an old sedan that chugged along at a steady pace. Riley gritted his teeth and slammed his fist against the steering wheel in frustration. He had been so certain he was onto something, but now he was back at square one. Just as he was about to turn around, his radio crackled again. "Unit 12, we have a report of unusual activity near your location." Possible federal vehicle sightings on Route 48. Can you respond? Riley's eyes widened slightly, and his hand shot out to grab the radio. Copy that, he said, his voice sharper now. I'm en route. His patrol car roared to life as he sped down the highway, his adrenaline surging once more. This was his chance to turn the night around, to prove that he wasn't just some small-town cop being outmaneuvered by federal agents. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he didn't care. All that mattered was regaining control. Unbeknownst to Riley, Nika and her team were well aware of his movements. The black SUVs had spread out strategically, some moving to nearby vantage points, while others maintained a low profile along the highway. Nika had insisted on monitoring Riley closely, convinced that he wasn't the type to let things go quietly. Her instincts had been right. He's on the move again, one of the agents reported, his voice crackling through Nika's earpiece. Heading toward Route 48. Looks like he's trying to pick up our trail. Nika sighed, a hint of frustration creeping into her otherwise calm demeanor. He's going to dig himself even deeper, she muttered. Does he even realize how far out of his league he is? The agent in the driver's seat glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Do you want us to intercept? He asked. We can shut this down before it goes any further. Nika shook her head. Not yet, she said. Let him chase shadows for a bit. We'll see how far he's willing to push this. The next half hour unfolded like a game of cat and mouse. Riley zigzagged across the highway, following vague reports and his own misguided instincts, while the SUVs maintained a careful distance, tracking his every move without revealing themselves. Nika watched it all unfold with a mixture of exasperation and curiosity. She couldn't help but wonder what drove a man like Riley to keep pursuing a fight he had already lost. Finally, the moment came. Riley spotted a vehicle parked on the side of a secluded stretch of road, a black SUV that matched the description he had been chasing all night. His heart pounded as he pulled over, his hand instinctively going to his holster. He stepped out of his car, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the SUV cautiously. But as he reached for the door handle, a voice stopped him cold. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Riley turned sharply, his hand flying to his gun. Standing a few feet away was Nika, her arms crossed and her expression calm but unyielding. Behind her, two agents emerged from the shadows, their presence silent but commanding. Riley's chest heaved as he struggled to process the situation. What the hell are you doing here? He demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and unease. I could ask you the same thing, Nika replied coolly. But I think we both know the answer. You couldn't let it go, could you? Riley's grip on his holster tightened. You think you can just walk all over me? He spat. I'm not done with you. Nika took a step closer, her gaze piercing. You were done the moment you decided to escalate this, she said. And now you're standing on the edge of a cliff. Officer Riley. The question is, how far are you willing to fall? For a moment, the tension between them was palpable, the night air heavy with the weight of unspoken threats. Then, slowly, Riley released his grip on his gun. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he looked defeated. Nika watched him carefully, her instincts still on high alert. She knew this wasn't over, not entirely. But for now, the game had shifted once again, and Riley was left to face the consequences of his own actions. The cold night air seemed to grow heavier as Riley stood frozen in place, his hand hovering near his holster as Nika's calm gaze bore into him. Behind her, the two agents stood motionless, their presence a silent reminder of how far out of his depth he truly was. Riley's mind raced, a whirlwind of anger, fear, and stubborn defiance. He had never been in a situation like this, where his authority was not just questioned but rendered utterly meaningless. Yet he couldn't bring himself to back down. The humiliation of the night so far gnawed at him, driving him to dig deeper into his misplaced sense of control. Nika took another step forward, her presence commanding without being aggressive. She wasn't trying to intimidate him, she didn't need to. Every fiber of her being exuded confidence and precision, and that was enough to make Riley's pulse quicken. "Officer Riley," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This is your last chance to walk away. Whatever you think you're doing here, it's only going to get worse for you if you keep pushing." Riley's jaw tightened, and his hand twitched near his weapon. "You think you can just waltz into my town and start giving me orders?" He shot back, his voice laced with anger. "I don't take orders from you. This is my jurisdiction, and I'll decide what happens here." Nika tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Your jurisdiction," she repeated, her tone measured. "Let me make something clear to you, officer. You're not just out of your jurisdiction, you're out of your league. And if you don't realize that soon, it's going to cost you." Her words hit harder than Riley wanted to admit. His pride bristled at the notion that he was being outmatched, outmaneuvered, by someone he still refused to see as anything more than an outsider. He took a step forward, trying to reclaim some semblance of authority, but the agents behind Nika shifted slightly, their presence a clear deterrent. Riley hesitated, his bravado faltering for a moment before he clenched his fists and pushed forward. "What's in that case?" he demanded, his voice rising. "What are you hiding? You think you can just flash a badge and make me forget what I've seen? You're not above the law." Nika's expression hardened, and for the first time a flicker of frustration crossed her face. "This isn't about the law, Riley," she said sharply. "This is about your ego. You couldn't stand the idea that someone didn't cower under your authority, so you've been chasing shadows all night, trying to prove something that doesn't exist." Riley's face flushed red, her words cutting through the thin veneer of control he had left. "Don't you lecture me," he snapped. "You don't know a damn thing about me or how I do my job." Nika took a step closer, her gaze unyielding. "I know exactly how you do your job," she said quietly, her voice carrying an edge that made Riley flinch. "I've seen men like you my entire career. You hide behind your badge and use it as a weapon, not a shield. You don't protect, you prey. And the moment someone challenges that, you lose control." The words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. Riley's chest heaved as he struggled to form a response, but nothing came. He glanced behind her at the agents, who were still watching him with cold, calculating eyes. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a physical force. Then, without warning, one of the agents raised a hand to his earpiece, his expression shifting slightly as he received an update. He stepped forward, his movements smooth and deliberate, and addressed Nika directly. "We've got a situation," he said, his tone calm but urgent. "Command is reporting a breach near the drop site. They're requesting immediate backup." Nika's eyes narrowed, her focus shifting instantly. "What kind of breach?" she asked, her voice now all business. The agent hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. "Unidentified personnel attempting to access the secure area. Possible hostile intent. Command wants us to regroup and secure the package." Nika nodded, her mind already calculating the next move. She turned back to Riley, who was watching the exchange with a mix of confusion and frustration. "This is where you step aside." "Officer," she said firmly, "whatever you think you're doing here, it's over. We have bigger problems to deal with." Riley's defiance flared again at her words. "I'm not going anywhere," he growled. "If there's a breach, I have a right to know what's going on. You don't get to shut me out." Nika's patience was wearing thin. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous low. "You've already done enough damage tonight," she said. "If you really care about doing your job, you'll stay out of our way and let us handle this. Otherwise, you'll only make things worse for everyone." Riley opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, the sound of distant engines echoed through the night. Everyone turned toward the horizon, where a cluster of lights was rapidly approaching. Nika's posture stiffened, and the agents moved into formation, their hands hovering near their concealed weapons. Whatever was coming, it wasn't part of the plan. Within moments, 3 vehicles came into view, their headlights cutting through the darkness. They weren't federal SUVs, these were civilian trucks, modified with heavy-duty frames and tinted windows. They roared down the road, kicking up dust as they approached. Nika exchanged a quick glance with the lead agent, her mind racing. This wasn't just a breach, it was a deliberate, coordinated move. The trucks skidded to a stop a short distance away, their engines still rumbling. For a moment there was silence, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. Then the doors of the trucks opened, and several figures stepped out. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces partially obscured by scarves and caps. They moved with a rough efficiency, not as trained professionals but as people who knew enough to be dangerous. Riley's hand instinctively went to his holster, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. "Who the hell are these people?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Nika didn't answer. Her focus was entirely on the newcomers, her mind calculating the risks and potential outcomes. One of the figures stepped forward, a tall man with a commanding presence. He didn't carry a visible weapon, but his posture and the way the others deferred to him made it clear he was in charge. "Evening," the man called out, his voice calm but laced with menace. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little gathering out here." Nika stepped forward, placing herself between the agents and Riley. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Turn around and leave before this goes any further." The man chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Now, why would we do that?" he asked. "We've got business here. Same as you." "This isn't your business," Nika replied sharply. "Walk away. Now." The man's expression hardened and he took another step forward. "See, that's where you're wrong," he said. "That case you're so protective of. It's worth a lot to the right people, and we're here to collect." The realization hit Riley like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about federal operations or jurisdiction, this was something far more dangerous. He glanced at Nika, whose focus never wavered. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt about his actions. Maybe he had underestimated the gravity of the situation. Maybe he had been wrong all along. The standoff stretched on, the air crackling with tension. Nika's mind raced, weighing her options. She knew a confrontation was inevitable, but she also knew they couldn't afford to lose control. "You don't know what you're dealing with," she said quietly, her words directed as much at Riley as at the intruders. "But if you make the wrong move, you'll regret it." The man smirked, his confidence unwavering. "Funny," he said. "I was about to say the same thing." With a quick gesture, he signaled to his crew, and they began to fan out, their movements deliberate and menacing. Nika's jaw tightened, and she glanced back at the agents. "Get ready," she said, her voice low. "This is going to get messy." And as the first figure reached for something in his jacket, the night exploded into chaos. The silence shattered in an instant as the first figure pulled a weapon from his jacket. The metallic glint caught the moonlight just as Nika shouted, "Take cover." Her voice was sharp, commanding, and cut through the chaos as the intruder raised his gun. A shot rang out, the sound reverberating through the stillness of the night, and the flash of muzzle fire lit up the darkness for a split second. The Secret Service agents reacted with the precision of a well-oiled machine, drawing their weapons and moving swiftly into defensive positions. Nika dove behind the nearest SUV, her back pressed against the cold metal as she assessed the situation. Riley, caught completely off guard, froze in place for a moment, his hand fumbling for his holster as he tried to process what was happening. His bravado and misplaced sense of control evaporated in an instant, replaced by a stark realization he was utterly unprepared for this. The intruders began to spread out, their movements chaotic but aggressive. They fired sporadically, their bullets ricocheting off the SUVs and sending sparks flying into the air. The agents returned fire with calculated precision, aiming to disable rather than kill, though the escalating violence made it clear that restraint might not be an option for long. Riley. Nika barked, her voice cutting through the cacophony. Get down, you're a liability standing out there. Her words jolted him into action. He stumbled backward, finally unholstering his gun, though his grip was shaky. He crouched behind his patrol car, his heart pounding as adrenaline surged through his veins. This wasn't the kind of situation he had ever trained for. This wasn't a traffic stop or a routine altercation. This was a battlefield, and he was completely out of his element. Nika, on the other hand, was in her element. She peeked around the corner of the SUV, quickly identifying the positions of the intruders. Her mind worked at lightning speed, analyzing their movements and coordinating with the other agents through her earpiece. 2 on the left flank, 1 on the ridge, and another moving toward the perimeter, she reported calmly. Contain them. We can't let them get to the case. The leader of the intruders, the tall man with the menacing presence, barked orders to his crew, his voice rising above the gunfire. Push forward. That case is ours. He moved with surprising agility, darting between cover points as he advanced toward the SUVs. It was clear he wasn't just leading this operation, he was driving it forward with singular focus. Nika knew she couldn't let him get any closer. She shifted her position, moving low and fast to flank him. As she closed the distance, she caught his attention, and their eyes locked for a brief moment. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, as if he realized she wasn't just another agent, she was the obstacle he hadn't anticipated. He raised his weapon, but Nika was faster. A single, well-placed shot from her sidearm struck his weapon, sending it clattering to the ground. Stand down, Nika shouted, her voice ringing with authority. This is over. You're not getting what you came for. The leader snarled in frustration, his hands twitching as though considering whether to reach for another weapon. But before he could act, one of the agents moved in from the side, disarming him and forcing him to the ground. The other intruders, seeing their leader subdued, hesitated for the first time, their movements faltering. Drop your weapons, Nika commanded, stepping forward with her weapon trained on the nearest intruder. Her voice carried an edge of steel, and the combination of her tone and the overwhelming presence of the agents left the remaining attackers with no choice. One by one, they began to lower their weapons and raise their hands in surrender. The tension lingered in the air, the adrenaline still coursing through everyone's veins. As the gunfire ceased and silence slowly returned, Nika didn't lower her weapon immediately. She kept it trained on the intruders as the agents moved in to secure them. Cuffs clicked into place, and weapons were confiscated as the scene came under control. Riley, still crouched behind his patrol car, finally found the courage to stand. His legs felt shaky, and his hands trembled as he holstered his weapon. He glanced around, taking in the aftermath of the skirmish, his mind reeling from everything he had just witnessed. His pride, so inflated just hours earlier, now felt like a distant memory, replaced by a sinking sense of inadequacy. Nika turned to the agents, issuing rapid instructions. Secure the case and sweep the area. I want every inch of this site checked for additional threats. We're not leaving anything to chance. As the agents moved to carry out her orders, Nika's gaze shifted to Riley. He was standing awkwardly by his patrol car, looking like a man who had been dropped into a foreign land without a map. She approached him, her expression unreadable, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps pity, or perhaps frustration. "Still think you're in control, officer?" she asked, her tone quiet but pointed. Riley opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was acutely aware of how out of his depth he had been, how badly he had misjudged the situation from the start. His pride wouldn't let him admit it outright, but the look in his eyes said enough. "You had no idea what you were walking into tonight," Nika continued. "You let your ego drive your decisions, and because of that, you put lives at risk, including your own." Her words stung, but Riley couldn't refute them. He looked down at the ground, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Hi, I didn't know," he muttered, the closest thing to an apology he could muster. Nika studied him for a moment, then sighed. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to ask. You didn't think. You assumed. And that assumption nearly got you killed." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Next time you see someone who doesn't fit your idea of who belongs, remember this moment. Remember how wrong you were." Riley didn't respond. He simply stood there, his mind churning with a mix of shame and anger, though this time the anger was directed more at himself than anyone else. The agents finished securing the area, and the leader of the intruders was loaded into one of the SUVs. As the convoy prepared to leave, Nika turned to Riley one last time. "This is where we part ways, officer," she said. "But make no mistake, you'll be hearing from us again. Actions have consequences, and tonight you'll learn that firsthand." With that, she climbed into the lead SUV, the door slamming shut with a sense of finality. The convoy pulled out onto the road, disappearing into the night as quickly as it had arrived. Riley stood alone by his patrol car, the quiet settling around him like a heavy weight. For the first time in his career, he felt truly small, not because of the confrontation, but because he had finally seen the limits of his authority. And it was a feeling he wasn't sure he would ever shake. As the tail lights of the SUVs faded into the distance, Riley let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging. He turned back toward his patrol car, his steps slow and deliberate. The night had humbled him in ways he hadn't thought possible, and though he wouldn't admit it aloud, he knew Nika's words would stay with him for a long time. The night air was heavy with the lingering tension of what had unfolded. Riley sat alone in his patrol car, the interior dimly lit by the glow of his dashboard. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving behind a hollow ache in his chest. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as he stared blankly at the dark road ahead. The flashing red and blue lights of his cruiser had been switched off, and the silence around him was deafening. It wasn't just the events of the night weighing on him, it was the realization of how wrong he had been, how thoroughly he had failed to understand what he was up against. For a man who prided himself on control, the sting of powerlessness was unbearable. The events replayed in his mind in vivid detail. He saw Nika's calm, commanding presence, the precision of her actions, and the way she had dismantled his authority without ever raising her voice. He saw the agents, professionals operating on a level he couldn't begin to comprehend, and the intruders who had brought chaos into a situation he thought he controlled. But most of all, he heard her words, sharp and cutting, echoing in his head like a judgment he couldn't escape. "You let your ego drive your decisions, and because of that you put lives at risk, including your own." Riley exhaled sharply, trying to push the thoughts away, but they clung to him like shadows. He wanted to blame her, to shift the weight of his guilt onto someone else, but deep down, he knew the truth. Nika hadn't done this to him, he had done it to himself. Every decision he had made, every assumption he had acted on, had led to this moment, and now he was left to face the consequences. The crackle of his radio jolted him from his thoughts. Unit 12, status report, came the dispatcher's voice, calm and professional. Riley hesitated, his hand hovering over the receiver. What could he say? How could he begin to explain what had happened without exposing his own mistakes? He pressed the button, his voice steadier than he expected. Unit 12, all clear, he said, the lie bitter on his tongue. Returning to station, the dispatcher acknowledged him, and the radio fell silent again. Riley leaned back in his seat, staring at the roof of his car. He didn't want to go back to the station, didn't want to face the questions that would inevitably come. He knew the agents had recorded everything, and it was only a matter of time before the footage reached the right hands. His superiors would see it, his colleagues would hear about it, and his reputation, fragile as it was, would crumble. For a man like Riley, who thrived on control and authority, the thought of being stripped of both was unbearable. Still, he had no choice. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life. The patrol car rolled down the empty road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. As he drove, Riley's thoughts drifted to the intruders, the men who had turned a tense standoff into a full-blown firefight. Who were they? What had they been after? And why had Nika and her team been so protective of that case? The questions gnawed at him, a reminder of how little he had understood the situation from the start. Back at the station, the mood was quiet but tense. Riley pulled into the lot, the fluorescent lights overhead casting harsh shadows across the rows of squad cars. He sat in his vehicle for a long moment, staring at the building's glass doors. Through the windows he could see a few officers milling about, their faces tired and uninterested. To them, it was just another quiet night in a small town. They had no idea what had happened on that lonely stretch of highway, no idea how close everything had come to spiraling out of control. Riley finally stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel as he walked toward the station. The cool night air bit at his skin, but he barely felt it. Inside, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights greeted him, along with the smell of stale coffee and old paper. A desk sergeant glanced up from his paperwork, his expression indifferent. "Riley," he said with a nod. Quiet shift. Riley hesitated for a fraction of a second before forcing a small smile. "Yeah," he lied. "Quiet." The sergeant grunted and returned to his work, and Riley made his way to his desk. The station felt like a different world now, so far removed from the intensity of what he had experienced just hours ago. He sat down heavily, staring at the stack of paperwork in front of him. His hands itched to do something, anything, to distract himself from the storm in his mind. But no amount of busywork could erase the memory of Nika's unwavering gaze, or the words she had left him with. Next time you see someone who doesn't fit your idea of who belongs, remember this moment. Remember how wrong you were. As the hours dragged on, Riley found himself replaying her final words, dissecting them in search of some way to disprove them. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized she was right. He had let his assumptions guide him. He had seen a black woman in an expensive car and immediately decided she didn't belong. He had ignored every sign that she was far more than she appeared to be, blinded by his need to assert control. And in doing so, he had not only endangered her but jeopardized an operation far beyond his understanding. The morning sun began to creep over the horizon, its pale light filtering through the station's windows. Riley sat slumped at his desk, his eyes heavy with exhaustion but his mind still racing. He knew the fallout from the night's events was only beginning. The footage from the agents would be reviewed, and questions would be asked, questions he couldn't answer without exposing his own failures. For the first time in his career, Riley felt a flicker of doubt about the man he was, about the way he carried himself and wielded his authority. He had always thought of himself as a protector, someone who upheld the law and maintained order. But now he couldn't shake the image of Nika standing before him, calm and unyielding, her words cutting through the facade he had built around himself. Was he really protecting anyone? Or was he just using his badge to shield his own insecurities? As the station came to life around him, Riley made a decision. It wasn't an easy one, and it wasn't something he could fully articulate even to himself. But he knew he couldn't keep pretending that nothing had happened. He couldn't keep living in the shadow of his own arrogance. If he wanted to move forward, he would have to face the truth about who he was and who he had become. Riley stood and walked toward the chief's office, his steps heavy but deliberate. The door was slightly ajar, and he could see the chief inside, sipping coffee and scanning a report. Riley hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering near the doorframe. Then, with a deep breath, he knocked and stepped inside. "Chief," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "We need to talk." The chief looked up, his expression curious but wary. "What's on your mind, Riley?" Riley closed the door behind him, his chest tightening as he prepared to speak. He didn't know where this conversation would lead, or what consequences it would bring. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was taking a step toward something real, something honest. And for now, that was enough.